Well, hello there fellow video shooters. In this video, I wanted to continue talking about how to film wedding videos, in particular, shooting solo. Today's tips should be really handy if you are just starting out, or even if you're a seasoned pro already. Now, I bag out S-Log a bit in this video, but that doesn't mean I don't use it. I love filming S-Log, but for my own projects. So, these are just my own tips and how I approach wedding filmmaking. Okay, I've been shooting weddings for about 9 years now, so I do have some experience to share. And actually I made some other videos about this topic already, which I will link here. Here probably. At the end of this video too, I might add some funny gaff that I made recently, an awkward gaff. So stick around at the end for that, hey? Right, so I shot an event this week and I had a friend come and help me out. And while we were there, he showed me some of his latest work, which was his first time shooting a wedding solo. And what impressed me the most was just how crystal clear the shots were and how perfect the skin tones were, because that's exactly how I like to shoot my own wedding films. So how did he achieve this? Well, he shot in 4K, first of all, on the Sony FX3 as the locked-off cam, but also 4K on an A9 on a gimbal. And he shot everything with picture profiles off and standard colors. So basically that's how the cameras come right out of the box. Now the A9 has beautiful skin tones. I remember that when I used to have one. The new A7S III and FX3, when shooting in standard, is getting much closer to that now too. So his video was actually much better than a lot of seasoned pros. It got me thinking, why are most of the wedding videos I see on the internet much poorer in quality? And that's the topic of today's video. The theme I like to recommend is, don't overthink it. Lots of clever people out there, but what happens most of the time is videographers overthinking the job. They think you have to shoot in S-Log and then follow other similar rules when shooting. And when it comes to cameras you're using for weddings and events, most of the common tutorials on YouTube are about S-Log and shutter rules and things like that. So I totally understand where they're coming from. They're trying to stick to these rules. I've shot weddings with a guy once who was a sound engineer previously, and he totally over-engineered the audio. So he had things daisy chained up, he had a Tascam DR10L, which is great on its own, taped to a mic. But then he had that wired up to another device through the headphone out, whether that was recording separately or wirelessly, I actually can't remember, to be honest. But all that meant was wires everywhere. And that was a while ago, but you get my point. He was overthinking it. And plus mainly it just looked ugly on camera. My friend this week too, on the other hand, he didn't overthink this sound either. He simply used a Rode wireless Go 2 device, which is professional and unobtrusive. The only thing I would add to that is also get a record out from the Celebrant's PA sound system if available, just as a backup redundancy. Okay, now back to the topic of today. Don't overthink it. Now, why do I keep seeing videos of a much poorer quality on the internet? I think it's because people are making things harder on themselves on the day by doing things like insisting on shooting S-Log. Now sure, technically S-Log gives you the most dynamic range, but it definitely adds a degree of difficulty to every shot. And gradually that increases the amount of mistakes over the whole day. Shooting in log also means you need a monitor, in most cases anyway, and also stacking filters to your lenses. If you're using diffusion filters, that can stack up as well on top of each other, and it can just muddy up your image, adding glass on top of glass. So sure, there is a very handy S-Log gamma assist function on the LCD now on most of these cameras, and that works well in a pinch, but for greater accuracy, you really need an external monitor. And of course, you always need to fuss over with ND filters and all that kind of stuff. But if you're using a cine camera with built-in NDs, then of course that does get easier. Oh, and don't forget my absolute anti-favorite, the dummy battery. If anything happens to that connection, you'll just lose the shot. The camera won't have time to power down, like to save the shot before powering down. But if you use the internal battery and a USB power bank, if you like as well, then if both goes flat or one goes flat, the camera will know to save the shot before shutting down. So apart from carrying more crap on the day, you'll also need to fiddle and fuss around for each shot. Another thing people forget is, if you use an external monitor, you need about 3 times the amount of batteries. The HDMI sucks the life out of the camera battery, plus you need extra battery power for your monitor too. So all this cumbersome weight. Another thing I see people fussing about and arguing about on the internet is shooting in manual focus versus autofocus. Now, I don't care how good you are at manual focusing, you're not going to beat my new Sony camera's autofocus. You just aren't. So this is overthinking it too. The last main thing I see videographers fuss about online is shooting handheld versus a gimbal or like a shoulder rig or things like that. Now, I've seen lots of threads about people asking whether it's best shooting handheld or using a gimbal, and I won't cover all of that today, but what I will say is handheld is actually fine most of the time, especially with this new active stabilization, except for formalities, obviously, then you really should use tripods. It's impossible to film a wedding, by the way, a wedding ceremony, with one roving camera and then one locked off camera, simply because you can't set down your roving camera and check on the locked off one to see if anyone's standing in the way or, you know, the couple's moved out of shot. And if that's the case, then you'll have, at that moment, no cameras covering the action. Okay, back to my friend's video. It was fine because in that instance, no one stood in front of his shot, luckily. Let's check my mic. The other thing that handheld can't quite do very well is walking shots. And you can do most handheld shots, but when it comes to walking, especially walking backwards, you just can't make that look stable enough. But active stave is good on most of the modern cameras if you yourself aren't moving. So I actually do both. I do handheld and gimbal. I do both now. But yeah, handheld for everything except for important walking shots, like walking out of the church down the aisle. So for that, I use a gimbal. Now, colors. Previously, I recommended shooting Cine 2 and using one of the color profiles like movie colors. And that ends up looking really warm, I'll admit, but still looks better for skin than most of the other color profiles, to be honest. I don't even like S-Cinetone, although in a pinch, if you shoot S-Cinetone, but then don't touch the grade, like leave it, then that can be fine. I'll come back to that again later. So now I just shoot with picture profiles turned off and use standard colors. They are, more punchier and more flattering for skin tones. Yeah, okay, so actually S-Cinetone. I've seen one wedding video online where the guy shot in S-Cinetone, but also in post he desaturated it, graded it in such a way that made the bride look kind of sick and jaundicey. And not only that, but by doing all these effects, he immediately dated his film. And to the casual viewer, that just looks unprofessional. I think what can happen is our eyes can get used to a certain look when you're taking ages on the computer. Your eyes can get tricked into a shot looking good. And one classic telltale sign people used to do when shooting in log back in the day was they didn't grade their footage back enough and their shots look flat, and then they would argue, but this is cinematic. And it doesn't, sorry. It just looks like it's not graded properly. And once again, this is kind of similar to overthinking. A great way to avoid this when editing is to have a reference frame or look that you're trying to achieve. Either always have it visible or keep bringing it up to make sure you've got it. And most of the time, it will be a look that is fresh because you liked it when you first saw it. But what happens is our eyes get used to what we're looking at. But thank God nowadays there are factory LUTs, etc. and all that kind of thing that when applied to log footage can get quite close to normal Rec 709 looking footage again. But yeah, back in the day, back in the early days of YouTube and Vimeo, I used to see heaps of footage that just simply wasn't graded enough. Because of the factory LUTs that are recommended for getting your shots back to Rec 709, I don't see the faded loggy look on indie films as much anymore. The best way for me to avoid that altogether when shooting weddings is to shoot with PP off and trust the nerds behind the color science of the camera, because they are much smarter than me anyway, unless I'm going for a certain look. I totally get it. shooting in log is the only way to get the most dynamic range out of the camera. But I only see a small percentage of people online actually doing this successfully, at least in their wedding videos. And most of the time they're shooting with a crew or with many cameras, so they can afford to make a mistake or two, or have extra time setting up their shots. There are exceptions though, of course. Some people have got quite fast and efficient shooting S-Log, but sadly, most haven't. I argue that most of the time, clients can't tell the difference or appreciate the extra dynamic range compared to shooting in picture profile off. And this rattles some people's brains. And I even have one friend say to me all the time, "Yeah, but Phil, when the couples see my shots, they just seem to mention how different and cinematic it looks." I just ask him, "Wow, so how much data are you using? Hey? Must be heaps." To which he concedes, "Yeah, it is quite a bit." "Yeah, but Phil, look at the highlight roll-off." Okay, fine. Save that for your own personal projects. It's a personal preference after all. I just prefer to shoot weddings my way, and I like to make each shot look like a photograph and get it looking great right in the camera. Straight away, no fuss. And if the bride is standing in front of a strong backlit window, I just make sure she looks good. If I can save a bit of the sky in the background though through the window, then great. Otherwise, no one really cares about the background. One criticism I seem to always get, at least online in comments, is people say things like, "There's a fine line between being efficient and being lazy," or "Why would you get a great camera like the A7S III and then shoot with PP off?" I get where they're coming from, but nah, I'm not being lazy, I'm shooting efficiently. And I'm not missing shots or making as many mistakes. The colors are beautiful right out of camera on pretty much all the new Sony cameras now. Although I hate the saying, I am shooting smarter and not harder on these wedding jobs. I don't have to crank the bitrate to the max, since I'm not going to grade it or do much to it in post. So, well, I can breeze through the edit, especially a long edit. It becomes much more efficient with playback speed and also much less grading. It already looks great. So, and even lately I've been shooting on the lowest bitrate, and I've found that to be a great balance of data because I'm already shooting in 4K. So it looks clear, colors are beautiful, and it breezes through the edit. So one more thing about shooting smarter and not harder is tripod fluid heads. If your camera is lighter, you actually don't necessarily need the $2,000 fluid head. That's more for like really heavy cameras, and a basic fluid head from Manfrotto is way more than fine. So I can run into a wedding reception from my car in one trip. Okay, we're nearly at the end. I want to talk a bit about how I shoot with picture profile off on my A7 IV and A7S III. I have the colors set to standard, like I said, but I also lower contrast a bit and lower sharpness and clarity too. And maybe even lower the saturation a tad also if you like. If you can remember to change some things for HD shooting, then I change the sharpness back, but because it's already quite soft in HD. But sometimes I'll forget to do that, so I pretty much just leave things as they are for both 4K and HD. Yeah, because I won't have time on my own weddings to do anything on the fly. You can even lower the highlights a bit too, to get away from the video look. For exposure, I do use auto exposure, but I make sure the camera won't let me go above 12,800. I also keep an eye on the shutter speed and ISO, and get that as low as possible, but with a little wiggle room, just in case the camera wants to go a tad darker if needed. Because if you're shooting by yourself, the sun might pop behind a cloud in an unmanned shot. Now the trick for these cameras is you can pretty much always leave the auto exposure dial on -0.3. And I find this gives consistently best results because the cameras tend towards making things too bright, even with face priority turned on when using multi or average exposure metering. There are some exceptions though, like if it's strong backlit, then you can raise your auto exposure compensation to like 0 or 0.7 or even +1. And the opposite is true in bright, directly lit front-on shots, like out in the sun. You can have the auto exposure compensation dial as low as -0.7 if you like, or even -1. And this is usually when I have an ND handy as well, especially for my new 50mm sexy 1.2 lens. Either way, I do tend to crank the shutter speed outdoors, which is my only vice, but the clients don't notice. For colors, I use auto white balance a lot, but for afternoon photo shoots, like when photographers are placing the couple under a tree, in the shade, with the sun behind, all that kind of thing, I use the shady white balance, and I think that gives lovely sunset colors, sunset vibes, because the Sony skin tones can get a bit funky under those lighting conditions. So shady white balance avoids that under those conditions. Another trick when using auto white balance is to lock it off whenever possible, especially when shooting indoors. What I do is point at something white, like my hat here, and depending on how fast you've set your shockless white balance setting in the camera, you just hold it there for long enough until the hat looks white. Then I lock my auto white off, and I have mine set to the C1 shortcut button on the back of the camera. I really wish these cameras had the same level of control on auto exposure, because I love the shockless white auto white function, that's great. I wish the auto exposure also had that. And sometimes in tricky lighting situations, the camera jumps around quite a lot, especially if the bride looks away and then back towards the partner or whatever. The camera can have a face as priority, but it'll just go back and forth to being bright and dark when the bride's face looks away and then back at the camera. So obviously, the solution to avoiding that is to lock off your auto exposure. And I use the default AEL button on the back for that as well. If you'd rather shoot on manual ISO and use the metering on the camera too instead, that's fine, of course. I stopped locking off exposure though when I shoot outdoor ceremonies on my own, because usually when we're outdoors, the camera performs really well and much better than tricky indoor lighting with backlight. I did use manual ISO in the past for outdoor weddings, but this one time the unmanned camera went completely dark, and that's because clouds came over. It was during the vows as well, and lucky I checked, because the bride's face was almost too dark to recover. And ever since then I decided not to overthink it, don't show off. I'm going to leave the auto exposure on, but give a bit of wiggle room. Don't leave it on the base ISO, in my case of 100. Maybe leave it at 200, just in case, once again, it needs to either get brighter or darker. Give it a bit of wiggle room. Anyway, if you got this far, I thank you so much for listening, because now, guess what? That's it. Well, for now anyway. So, yeah, I made a funny gaffe at a wedding a couple of weeks ago. I do need glasses now, these little guys, but I don't need it for close-up, so sometimes I don't wear them. I mean, the camera, it's fine. For the preps in the morning, I don't think I'll wear glasses, because we're in a small room and I want to see my camera as priority. I haven't set my diopter yet to shoot with glasses, and that's probably coming soon. I know a lot of you shoot with glasses and you have to set your diopter. But for me, I just keep it default for now, out of the box, new camera. There we go, indoors. Anyway, so I need glasses, and that I'm in this bridal prep for the girls, and one of the first things I noticed was the mother of the groom was in there too, and she looked quite young, quite a young looking groom's mum. And I remember thinking, some good looking people around me and whatever. And she gets up and she sits in the makeup chair, and I think, okay, I'll get a good shot of that. Grab my monopod, and I'm setting it up. I've got my 51.2, so it's bright as shit. So I'm like, oh, okay, spin that down. Let's still shoot at 1.2, but let's crank it. And so glasses were off, and I look up, and I didn't notice anything had changed. And I said, hey, wow. Now I can see where the groom gets his good looks from, right? It's a daggy kind of I like saying this to the older people, to the parents, it gets a good laugh or whatever. But the look on her face just dropped and she looked horrified. And as I looked closer, I realized I took so long setting up that the mother had sat down for like 2 seconds, and it was a bridesmaid that sat there in the chair. And to make it worse, even though she was I found out later in the night, she was like late 20s, blonde lady, but she had 3 kids already, and she did care about her looks a lot. She had the fake lips and everything, skin was a bit sun damaged, so she looked a bit older than what she was. And obviously because she'd spent the money on her face and whatever, she cares about how she looks and how old she looks. So I've lifted my stupid head and I've gone, so I can see where, you know, the groom gets his good looks from. And at that moment in a busy room, it also just happened that, you know, hair was over there, kids were talking over there, that everyone just happened to be quiet at that one moment. And so about 3 or 4 or 5 painful seconds went past. And then a lot of people laughed and she was like swearing, like, huh? Oh, fuck off. And then I went, hey, sorry, I don't know, I thought she was sitting there and whatever, and I tried to explain my glasses and whatever, but she was already devastated, I could tell. And I spent all day making that better, and I talked to her alone after, like, even reception. I think she was salty with me all day, and I tried my best to patch that up. I'm a people pleaser. I started with things like, oh, I wouldn't say that to you, you know, like a beautiful young girl. I just didn't have my glasses on. And initially she brushed that off because she's already angry, and when people are angry, they can't think. But eventually she understood. I could see the understanding drop in her eyes, but it took till literally 7 p.m. that night. That's all I wanted to say on that. But I really felt not only stupid, but I felt for the actual mum who was there, because she didn't look bad and she didn't look that old, middle-aged lady. But just how much this girl and her sisters were going on about it. I don't look old, I don't look old. And like, I could see this poor woman's face starting to drop as well. And anyway, it was a disaster. I notched that down as a fail, even though I think I saved it, because I think I've got much higher, a higher bar. I like to make people happy and stuff. So I'll remember never to do that or say anything like that. In 9 years, pretty lucky that that's probably the worst gaffe I've ever done. Yeah. Anyway, this is going to be really long, so I thank you heaps for sticking around, and I'll see you on the next video.